The morning fog clung to the streets of Millbrook, Oregon, like a gray shroud that refused to lift, even as the October sun struggled to break through. Thaddeus Merrow stood in his kitchen, watching the familiar ritual of his neighbor Cornelius Blackthorne through the window that separated their modest suburban homes. Every morning at 7:15 a.m. sharp, Cornelius would emerge from his back door, coffee mug in hand, and check his security cameras with the dedication of a man guarding state secrets. Thaddeus had always found his neighbors' surveillance habits excessive for their quiet residential street, where the most exciting crime in recent memory had been teenagers toilet papering the Henderson house last Halloween. But Cornelius was a retired IT specialist who treated home security like a professional obsession, constantly upgrading his camera system and monitoring equipment with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed danger lurked around every corner. The knock on Thaddeus's front door came at exactly 7:30 a.m., just as he was finishing his second cup of coffee. Cornelius stood on the porch, holding his smartphone with the eager expression of someone about to share a revolutionary discovery. "Thaddeus, my friend," Cornelius began, his voice carrying the slight accent that hinted at his Eastern European origins, "I have something incredible to show you. This will change everything about how we keep our neighborhood safe." Thaddeus opened the screen door, curious despite his usual wariness of Cornelius's technological enthusiasms. His neighbor had a tendency to get excited about apps and gadgets that promised to solve problems most people didn't know they had. "Come in," Thaddeus said, leading him to the living room. "What's got you so worked up this time?" Cornelius settled into the worn leather armchair, his fingers already dancing across his phone screen. "It's called NeighborWatch Pro. Absolutely revolutionary community safety application. It connects everyone's home security cameras into a shared network, creating a comprehensive surveillance web across the entire neighborhood." Thaddeus raised an eyebrow. At 42, he'd lived in Millbrook long enough to remember when people solved neighborhood issues by actually talking to each other instead of relying on technology. "Shared surveillance? Isn't that a bit invasive?" "That's the beauty of it," Cornelius continued, his enthusiasm undeterred. "It's completely anonymous and automated. The app uses artificial intelligence to monitor feeds from participating households and alerts users to suspicious activity. No human operator actually watches the footage unless there's a genuine security concern." He showed Thaddeus the app interface on his phone, a clean, professional design with a map of their neighborhood dotted with small camera icons. Green dots indicated active cameras, while red dots showed areas without coverage. "Look how many people are already using it," Cornelius pointed to the screen. "Mrs. Evangeline Ashford across the street, the Crescent family on Oak Avenue, even old Percival Grimsby at the end of the block. Nearly half the neighborhood has signed up in just 3 weeks." Thaddeus studied the map, surprised by how many of his neighbors had apparently embraced this digital surveillance network. "And it's free." "Completely free," Cornelius confirmed. "The company, Sentinel Dynamics, is apparently funded by venture capital. They're beta testing the technology in small communities like ours before rolling it out nationally." Something about the setup made Thaddeus uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was the idea of his daily routines being monitored by artificial intelligence, or the thought that his neighbors were essentially spying on each other under the guise of community safety. "I appreciate you thinking of me," Thaddeus said diplomatically, "but I'm not really comfortable with the surveillance aspect. We've lived here peacefully for years without needing to watch each other through cameras." Cornelius's expression shifted to one of gentle disappointment. "I understand your hesitation, my friend, but consider the practical benefits. Just last week, the app helped identify teenagers vandalizing the playground equipment. The Ashford family received an alert, and the police arrived in time to prevent serious damage. Teenagers being teenagers isn't exactly a national security threat," Thaddeus pointed out. "Perhaps not," Cornelius conceded, "but what about break-ins, package theft, suspicious vehicles casing houses? The app creates a protective network that benefits everyone, even those who choose not to participate directly." After Cornelius left, Thaddeus found himself thinking about their conversation throughout the day. He taught high school English at Millbrook Regional, and during lunch break, he mentioned the neighbor surveillance app to his colleague Ophelia Ravencroft, who taught computer science and generally stayed current with technology trends. "NeighborWatch Pro?" Ophelia frowned, pausing with her sandwich halfway to her mouth. "I haven't heard of it," which is unusual for surveillance applications, Most of them generate significant privacy concerns that make tech news. She pulled out her laptop and began searching. Sentinel Dynamics, that's interesting. Very little online presence for a company supposedly running a major beta test. Their website is basically a single page with generic corporate language about community safety solutions. Thaddeus leaned over her shoulder to read the sparse website content. That does seem odd for a venture capital-funded startup. Extremely odd, Ophelia confirmed, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she dug deeper into search results. Most legitimate companies in this space are very transparent about their funding, their executive team, their privacy policies. This looks more like a shell company than a genuine technology startup. That evening, as Thaddeus graded essays in his home office, he found himself periodically glancing out the window at Cornelius's house. His neighbor's security cameras were more numerous and sophisticated than he'd previously realized. Discrete devices mounted under eaves, hidden among landscaping, positioned to capture multiple angles of both properties. The thought that bothered him most wasn't the surveillance itself, but the realization that he'd become accustomed to being watched without ever consenting to it. How many of his neighbors had cameras that could see into his yard, his windows, his daily routines? And now, with this app connecting them all, how many people had access to footage of his private life? His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Your neighbor Cornelius Blackthorne suggested you might be interested in NeighborWatch Pro. As a community leader and educator, your participation would greatly benefit neighborhood safety. Download link, shortened URL. Thaddeus stared at the message, disturbed by several implications. How had they gotten his phone number? How did they know he was an educator? And most importantly, why was a supposedly anonymous app sending personalized recruitment messages? He forwarded the text to Ophelia with a message. This is getting stranger. Can you look into this app more thoroughly? Her response came back within minutes. Already working on it. Something is definitely not right about this whole operation. Don't download anything until we know more. As night settled over Millbrook, Thaddeus found himself studying his neighborhood with new eyes. The familiar streetlights and quiet houses now seemed part of a network he didn't fully understand, watched by cameras and monitored by software controlled by people he'd never met. Tomorrow, he decided, he would start asking more questions. If half his neighbors were participating in this surveillance network, he needed to understand exactly what they'd all agreed to, and what it meant for the privacy and safety of everyone in Millbrook. The fog was already beginning to form again outside his window, but this time it felt less like a natural weather pattern, and more like a curtain being drawn over secrets he was only beginning to discover. The next morning brought an unusual sight that made Thaddeus pause with his coffee mug halfway to his lips. Cornelius wasn't performing his typical 7:15 a.m. security check. Instead, his neighbor stood in his driveway, engaged in intense conversation with two people Thaddeus didn't recognize, a woman in a dark business suit and a man carrying what appeared to be professional camera equipment. Thaddeus watched from his kitchen window as the trio examined different angles around Cornelius's property, the woman pointing toward various houses while the man took notes on a tablet. When they gestured toward Thaddeus's own home, he instinctively stepped back from the window, though he doubted they could see him clearly through the morning shadows. His phone rang, startling him from his surveillance of the surveillors. Thaddeus, Ophelia's voice carried an edge of excitement mixed with concern. I stayed up late researching that app, and what I found is extremely disturbing. What did you discover? First, Sentinel Dynamics doesn't exist in any meaningful way. The business registration leads to a mail forwarding service in Delaware. The app itself is incredibly sophisticated, too sophisticated for a startup. We're talking about military-grade facial recognition, behavioral analysis algorithms, and data processing capabilities that would cost millions to develop. Thaddeus set down his coffee, his attention fully focused on the conversation. So, who's really behind it? That's where it gets complicated, Ophelia continued. The app's code signature traces back to a subsidiary of a company called Omniview Technologies. They specialize in government surveillance contracts and private intelligence gathering. Through his window, Thaddeus watched the mysterious visitors climb into a black sedan and drive away, leaving Cornelius standing in his driveway with an expression that looked more troubled than triumphant. Government surveillance? Thaddeus asked. In Millbrook? It gets worse, Ophelia said. I downloaded the app using a secure virtual machine to examine its permissions and data collection practices. Thaddeus, this thing doesn't just access security cameras. It requests permission to use device microphones, location services, contact lists, photo galleries, even text message history. Thaddeus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning, and people are just agreeing to this? The permission requests are buried in pages of legal language that most users never read. But here's the really disturbing part. The app is collecting and transmitting far more data than it's supposed to, even according to its own privacy policy. It's sending location data, audio samples, and behavioral pattern analysis to servers that aren't owned by Sentinel Dynamics. Where are the servers? That's the million-dollar question. The data routing is incredibly complex, bouncing through multiple countries and proxy services. But the final destination appears to be facilities owned by private intelligence contractors with government ties. Thaddeus sat down heavily in his kitchen chair. So our neighbors think they're participating in a community safety program, but they're actually feeding data to some kind of intelligence operation? That's exactly what it looks like. And Thaddeus, based on the app's user map, they have coverage of nearly every house in Millbrook. Even if you're not participating, your neighbors' cameras are probably capturing footage of your property, your daily routines, your visitors. After ending the call, Thaddeus spent his morning reviewing what he knew about his neighbors' recent behavior changes. Mrs. Evangeline Ashford had indeed seemed more vigilant lately, often peering out her windows at passing cars and pedestrians. The Crescent family had installed new exterior lighting and seemed to spend more time documenting visitors with their phones. During his lunch break at school, Thaddeus decided to conduct an informal survey. He mentioned the neighborhood surveillance app to several colleagues who lived in different parts of town. "Oh, we got that a few weeks ago," said Marcellus Whitmore, who taught history. "My wife Serafina was initially hesitant, but our neighbor convinced us it was just a harmless community safety tool. The installation was surprisingly comprehensive. They sent a technician to optimize our existing cameras and install additional sensors." "They sent technicians?" Thaddeus asked. "I thought it was just an app." "The basic version is app only," Marcellus explained. "But for maximum effectiveness, they offer free professional installation of enhanced cameras and monitoring equipment. Very generous, really. Most companies would charge thousands for that kind of setup." Thaddeus's unease deepened. A free app was one thing, but a company providing free professional security installations across multiple neighborhoods suggested resources and motivations far beyond a simple startup venture. That afternoon, he decided to walk through his neighborhood with fresh eyes, looking for signs of the surveillance network's true scope. What he discovered was more extensive than he'd imagined. Nearly every house showed evidence of recent security upgrades: new cameras, additional lighting, small devices mounted near mailboxes and driveways that could be sensors or recording equipment. The installations were professional quality and remarkably uniform, suggesting a coordinated deployment rather than individual homeowner decisions. At the end of Oak Avenue, he encountered Percival Grimsby, an elderly widower who'd lived in Millbrook longer than almost anyone. Percival was examining a small device mounted on his mailbox post with obvious confusion. "Percival!" Thaddeus called out, approaching his longtime neighbor. "How are you doing?" "Oh, hello, Thaddeus," Percival replied, his weathered face creased with worry. "I'm trying to understand what this thing is. The installation technician said it was part of my new security system, but I don't remember agreeing to have anything installed." Thaddeus examined the device, a sleek black cylinder about the size of a smartphone, with what appeared to be camera lenses and sensors on multiple sides. It was more sophisticated than typical home security equipment. "Do you remember signing up for NeighborWatch Pro?" Thaddeus asked gently. Percival's confusion deepened. "My grandson helped me download something on my phone last month, said it would help keep the neighborhood safe, but I didn't expect people to start installing things on my property without asking permission. Have you tried calling the company to ask questions?" "That's the strange part," Percival said, pulling out his phone to show the app interface. "There's no customer service number, no way to contact them directly. The app just says to consult with your neighborhood coordinator if you have concerns." "Neighborhood coordinator?" Apparently that's Cornelius Blackthorne. He's been designated as the local point person for technical issues and neighbor concerns. That evening, Thaddeus decided to confront Cornelius directly. He found his neighbor in his backyard, adjusting one of his many cameras with the focused attention of someone performing a crucial task. "Cornelius," Thaddeus called over the fence, separating their properties. "Could we talk for a moment?" Cornelius looked up, his expression immediately guarded. "Of course, my friend. What can I help you with?" I'm curious about your role as neighborhood coordinator for this surveillance app. It seems like a significant responsibility. Cornelius set down his tools, his demeanor shifting from friendly enthusiasm to something more cautious. The company selected me based on my technical background and community involvement. It's really quite an honor to help improve neighborhood safety. And the free installations? That must be expensive for a startup company. Sentinel Dynamics is very committed to their pilot program, Cornelius replied, his answers sounding increasingly rehearsed. They understand that community safety requires proper infrastructure investment. Thaddeus studied his neighbor's face, noticing tension around his eyes that hadn't been there during their previous conversation. Cornelius, are you certain this is just a community safety program? Because some aspects of it seem concerning. For a moment, Cornelius's carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing something that looked almost like fear. Thaddeus, he said quietly, glancing around as if checking for listening devices, sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions about things that are helping keep us safe. The response sent a chill through Thaddeus. His neighbor wasn't just participating in this surveillance network, he was afraid of it. And if Cornelius, with all his technical knowledge and apparent inside access, was frightened by what he'd helped create, then the true scope of what was happening in Millbrook was far more dangerous than Thaddeus had imagined. As he walked back to his house, Thaddeus noticed something he'd missed before. Small red lights blinking in the darkness, scattered throughout the neighborhood like electronic eyes that never slept. Whatever NeighborWatch Pro really was, it had already embedded itself deeply into the fabric of their community. The question now wasn't whether his neighbors were being watched. It was who was doing the watching, and what they planned to do with all the information they were collecting. 2 days later, Ophelia arrived at Thaddeus's house carrying a laptop bag and wearing the determined expression of someone who'd spent sleepless nights unraveling a digital mystery. She'd agreed to help him investigate the surveillance network more thoroughly, using her computer science expertise to dig deeper into what was really happening in Millbrook. I brought some specialized software, she announced, setting up her equipment on Thaddeus's dining room table. If we're going to understand this surveillance network, we need to see what it's actually doing, not just what it claims to do. Thaddeus had spent the previous evening documenting everything unusual he'd observed, the coordinated camera installations, the mysterious visitors to Cornelius's house, the sophisticated monitoring devices that seemed far too advanced for a community safety app. The pattern suggested something much more organized and well-funded than a simple startup venture. Before we start, Ophelia said, powering up her laptop, I should warn you that what we're about to do exists in a legal gray area. We're not hacking into anyone's systems, but we are analyzing network traffic and data transmissions that might be considered sensitive. I understand, Thaddeus replied, but if our neighbors are unknowingly participating in some kind of intelligence operation, don't we have an obligation to find out? Ophelia connected a small device to Thaddeus's internet router, a network analyzer that would monitor all digital traffic flowing through the neighborhood's internet connections. Within minutes, her screen filled with streams of data, representing the digital communications happening around them. This is remarkable, she said, studying the patterns scrolling across her monitor. The volume of data transmission from NeighborWatch Pro users is enormous, far more than would be necessary for simple security monitoring. She pointed to specific data streams, highlighted in red. These are continuous transmissions, video, audio, and metadata flowing from participating houses to external servers. But look at this pattern. Thaddeus leaned over her shoulder to examine the network analysis. Even with his limited technical knowledge, he could see that the data flows were far more complex than simple security camera uploads. The app isn't just collecting security footage, Ophelia explained. It's transmitting location data, behavioral analysis, communication patterns, even biometric information like gait recognition and facial mapping. This is comprehensive surveillance, not community safety. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, following digital trails through layers of network routing and data processing. And here's the most disturbing part. The servers receiving this information aren't just collecting it, they're analyzing it and sharing results with other systems. What kind of other systems? Government databases, credit reporting agencies, employment verification services, even social media monitoring platforms. Your neighbor's surveillance data is being integrated into comprehensive profiles that track everything from their daily routines to their financial habits and political affiliations. Thaddeus felt sick. So everyone who signed up for this community safety app has actually agreed to have their entire lives monitored and analyzed. Worse than that, Ophelia continued, her expression growing more troubled as she dug deeper into the data patterns. The system is using the combined surveillance network to build profiles on everyone in the neighborhood, even people who haven't consented to participate. She showed him a visualization of the surveillance coverage, a digital map of Millbrook with overlapping fields of view from cameras and sensors, creating what amounted to total area monitoring. Your daily routines, your visitors, your shopping habits, your social interactions. It's all being recorded and analyzed even though you never agreed to participate. The network effect means that opting out individually is virtually meaningless. As if summoned by their conversation, Thaddeus's doorbell rang. Through the window he could see Cornelius standing on his front porch, but his neighbor looked different, nervous, constantly glancing over his shoulder as if checking for observers. "Don't let him see the laptop," Ophelia whispered, quickly closing her analysis programs. Thaddeus opened the door to find Cornelius holding an envelope with shaking hands. "I need to give you this," Cornelius said without preamble, pressing the envelope into Thaddeus's hands. "But you must promise me you won't tell anyone where you got it." "Cornelius, what's going on? You look terrified." His neighbor glanced around nervously before stepping closer. "The people running NeighborWatch Pro, they're not who they claim to be. I've learned things, disturbing things about what they're really doing with our data." "What kind of things?" "I can't discuss it here," Cornelius whispered urgently. "Too many devices are listening, but that envelope contains information you need to see. Be careful who you trust, Thaddeus. This situation is much more dangerous than any of us realized." With that, Cornelius hurried back to his house, leaving Thaddeus standing in his doorway with more questions than answers. Inside the envelope was a USB drive and a handwritten note. "Thaddeus, I made a terrible mistake encouraging people to install this surveillance system. The company isn't interested in community safety. They're building detailed intelligence profiles on American citizens for purposes I'm not allowed to discuss. The USB contains evidence, but accessing it puts you at risk. They monitor everything now, including this conversation. If something happens to me, contact Agent Lysander Cross at the FBI field office in Portland. Tell him Cornelius sent you, and give him the evidence. Be careful. They know who's asking questions." CB Ophelia read the note over Thaddeus's shoulder, her face pale. "This confirms what I've been discovering in the network analysis. We're not dealing with a startup or even a private intelligence company. This has government intelligence written all over it." "Then we need to contact this FBI agent," Thaddeus said, but Ophelia shook her head. "Not yet. If Cornelius is right about the level of surveillance, they already know we've been investigating. We need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with before we contact law enforcement." She inserted Cornelius's USB drive into a secure, isolated computer she'd brought specifically for analyzing potentially dangerous data. The drive contained hundreds of files, technical specifications, communication logs, organizational charts, and most disturbing of all, sample intelligence reports generated from Millbrook surveillance data. "Look at this," Ophelia said, opening a file labeled Subject Behavioral Analysis Sample Report. The document was a comprehensive psychological and behavioral profile of Mrs. Evangeline Ashford, compiled from weeks of surveillance data. It included her daily routines, social interactions, political affiliations based on websites visited, health status inferred from pharmacy visits, financial situation derived from shopping patterns, and even relationship status based on visitor analysis. "This isn't just surveillance," Thaddeus realized with growing horror. "It's intelligence gathering on American citizens in their own homes." "And it gets worse," Ophelia said, scrolling through more files. "Look at the scale of the operation." The organizational documents revealed that Millbrook was just one of over 200 communities across the United States where similar surveillance networks had been deployed. The operation, codenamed Neighborhood Eyes, was a massive intelligence gathering program targeting suburban and small-town America. "They're mapping the entire social, economic, and political landscape of American communities," Ophelia said quietly. "Building a database of behavioral patterns, social networks, and individual profiles that would make East Germany's Stasi envious." Thaddeus stared at the evidence, feeling overwhelmed by the implications. "But why? What's the purpose of all this surveillance?" Before Ophelia could answer, both of their phones simultaneously received text messages from unknown numbers. Your investigation has been noted. Cease all research activities immediately or face serious consequences. This is your only warning." They looked at each other in silence, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. They had uncovered a massive domestic surveillance operation, and now they were being directly threatened by whoever was running it. "We can't stop now," Thaddeus said firmly. "Too many people's privacy and freedom are at stake." "Then we need to move fast," Ophelia replied, copying the USB data to encrypted storage devices. "Because if they're willing to threaten us directly, they're probably planning to do much more than send text messages." Outside, Thaddeus noticed that Cornelius's house was dark, unusual for his security-obsessed neighbor, who typically kept multiple lights on throughout the evening. A sinking feeling told him that their source of inside information might no longer be available to help them. The surveillance network they'd been investigating had revealed its true nature, and now they were trapped within its gaze, racing against time to expose the truth before whoever was watching decided to take more aggressive action. The next morning brought an ominous silence from Cornelius's house that confirmed Thaddeus's worst fears. His neighbor's usual morning routine, the systematic checking of cameras, the careful inspection of his property perimeter, the methodical documentation of overnight activity, was conspicuously absent. The house sat dark and still, as if abandoned overnight. Thaddeus called Ophelia before sunrise. "I think they've taken Cornelius." "Are you certain?" Her voice was tense, suggesting she'd spent the night analyzing the threatening messages they'd received. "His house has been completely dark since yesterday evening. No movement, no lights, no security checks. For someone as paranoid about surveillance as Cornelius, total digital silence means something's very wrong." "Then we need to move quickly," Ophelia said. "I've been analyzing the data from his USB drive, and what I've found is worse than we thought. This isn't just domestic surveillance. It's a comprehensive social control system." They agreed to meet at the school, reasoning that a public location with multiple witnesses would provide some protection from whoever was monitoring their activities. Thaddeus arrived early, using his access to the building to secure a classroom where they could work without obvious observation. Ophelia brought a portable secure communication device, a specialized laptop that could operate independently of monitored internet connections. "I've been cross-referencing the Neighborhood Eyes documents with public records and news reports," she explained, setting up her equipment. "The pattern is terrifying." She showed him a map of the United States dotted with red circles representing communities where the surveillance system had been deployed. "Look at the selection criteria for target locations." Thaddeus studied the pattern, noting that the marked communities shared certain characteristics: suburban neighborhoods with high home ownership rates, educated populations, and moderate political affiliations. "They're not targeting high-crime areas or regions with known security threats," he realized. "They're surveilling stable middle-class American communities." "Exactly," Ophelia confirmed. "And look at this timeline." The deployment schedule showed a systematic rollout over the past 18 months, with new communities added at regular intervals. Each location underwent the same process: identification of a local coordinator, gradual introduction of the Community Safety app, professional installation of enhanced surveillance equipment, and finally, comprehensive data collection and analysis. "They're building a detailed map of American social and political behavior," Thaddeus said, understanding the full scope of what they'd discovered. "Not to prevent crime, but to understand and potentially influence how communities think and act." Ophelia nodded grimly. "The behavioral analysis reports go far beyond individual surveillance. They're studying social networks, political influence patterns, economic behaviors, even how information and opinions spread through communities." She opened another set of files from Cornelius's drive. "But here's what really concerns me: evidence that they're not just collecting data, they're starting to actively influence community behavior." The documents revealed a pilot program called Social Stability Enhancement, where the surveillance system had been used to identify and subtly discourage what the operators termed disruptive social behaviors. In several test communities, people who organized political protests, criticized local government decisions, or even participated in neighborhood disputes had experienced a series of minor but persistent problems: parking tickets, permit delays, unexpected tax audits, employment difficulties. "It's social engineering on a massive scale," Thaddeus said, feeling sick as he read through example cases. "They're using surveillance data to identify and punish people whose behavior they consider problematic." And if the pattern holds, Millbrook is about to become a test site for the next phase of the program, Ophelia added, pointing to deployment schedules that showed their community marked for Phase 3 implementation. Before they could delve deeper into what Phase 3 entailed, Thaddeus's phone rang. The caller ID showed his principal, Dorothea Sterling, calling from the school's main office. "Thaddeus," her voice carried an unusual tension, "I need you to come to my office immediately. There are some people here who need to speak with you about a community matter." Thaddeus exchanged glances with Ophelia. "What kind of community matter?" "I think it's better if they explain in person," Dorothea replied, but her tone suggested she was reading from a script rather than speaking freely. "I'll be right there," Thaddeus said, ending the call with growing apprehension. "It's a trap," Ophelia said immediately. "They're using your employer to draw you into a controlled environment." "Probably," Thaddeus agreed, "but if I don't go, they'll know we're actively avoiding them. That might put other people at risk." They quickly copied the most critical evidence files to multiple encrypted drives, hiding them in various locations throughout the classroom. If something happened to them, at least the evidence would survive. "I'm going with you," Ophelia insisted. "No, you need to contact that FBI agent, Lysander Cross. If they detain me, you'll be our only hope of getting this information to law enforcement." As Thaddeus walked through the school hallways toward the principal's office, he noticed several things that seemed unusual. Additional security cameras had been installed overnight, and there were at least 3 people in the building he didn't recognize, visitors who seemed more focused on observing than participating in any educational purpose. Principal Sterling's office contained 2 individuals who radiated the kind of professional authority that suggested federal law enforcement or intelligence services. The woman was middle-aged, with sharp features and a business suit that screamed government agency, while the man appeared to be in his 30s with the athletic build and alert eyes of someone accustomed to potentially dangerous situations. "Mr. Merrow," the woman said, rising from her chair with a practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Agent Victoria Nightshade from the Department of Homeland Security. This is my colleague, Agent Casper Thornfield. We understand you've been asking questions about community safety initiatives in your neighborhood." Thaddeus took the offered seat, noting that Principal Sterling looked uncomfortable and avoided making eye contact with him, a clear indication that she wasn't participating in this meeting voluntarily. "I've been curious about a surveillance app that many of my neighbors have adopted," Thaddeus replied carefully. "As an educator, I'm naturally interested in how technology affects community dynamics." "Of course," Agent Nightshade said, consulting a tablet computer. "Your interest in Neighbor Watch Pro has been noted, along with your collaboration with Ms. Ophelia Ravencroft in analyzing network traffic and data patterns." The casual mention of Ophelia's involvement confirmed Thaddeus's suspicion that they'd been under comprehensive surveillance throughout their investigation. These agents knew exactly what he and Ophelia had discovered. "Mr. Merrow," Agent Thornfield said, speaking for the first time, "the program you've been investigating is part of a classified national security initiative designed to protect American communities from various threats. Your unauthorized research has potentially compromised sensitive operations. What kind of threats require surveilling law-abiding citizens in their own homes?" Thaddeus asked. "The kind that require citizens to trust their government's judgment about necessary security measures," Agent Nightshade replied, her tone becoming noticeably less friendly. "Mr. Merrow, we're prepared to offer you a choice. You can cease your investigation, sign a national security non-disclosure agreement, and return to your normal life as an educator. Or we can discuss your research activities in a more formal setting." The threat was clear, but Thaddeus found himself thinking about Cornelius's obvious fear, about the comprehensive behavioral profiles being compiled on his neighbors, about the social control system that was being tested in communities across America. "I need to understand what happened to Cornelius Blackthorne," he said. Agent Nightshade exchanged glances with her partner. "Mr. Blackthorne violated the terms of his cooperation agreement with our department. He's been relocated to a position where he can't compromise ongoing operations." "You mean he's been disappeared for trying to warn people about what you're really doing?" "We prefer to think of it as protecting national security interests," Agent Thornfield said, "just as we're prepared to protect those interests from other potential threats to the program." Thaddeus understood that he was being given one final opportunity to walk away before facing whatever consequences they deemed appropriate for interfering with their surveillance operation. But he also understood that walking away meant abandoning his neighbors and potentially hundreds of other communities to a system of control that fundamentally violated American principles of privacy and freedom. "I need time to consider your offer," he said finally. "I have until tomorrow morning," Agent Nightshade replied, standing to indicate the meeting was over. "We'll contact you then to discuss your decision." As Thaddeus left the principal's office, he noticed that the additional security cameras were tracking his movement through the hallways. The surveillance network they'd been investigating had revealed its true power, the ability to reach into any institution, any workplace, any community, to exert control over individuals who posed a threat to the system. But somewhere in Millbrook, Ophelia was working to contact law enforcement outside the compromised chain of command. And somewhere in the evidence they'd gathered was proof of a domestic surveillance program that American citizens deserved to know about, regardless of the personal cost of exposing it. The game had become deadly serious, but Thaddeus was committed to seeing it through to the end. That evening, Thaddeus returned home to find his house had been visited. Nothing appeared to be missing, but the subtle signs were unmistakable to someone who knew his own space intimately. Books reshelved in slightly different positions, papers organized with a precision he'd never maintained, even his coffee mug positioned differently than he'd left it that morning. They'd searched his house professionally, leaving no obvious evidence of intrusion while making it clear that his privacy was completely compromised. More disturbing was the realization that they'd probably installed additional surveillance equipment during their visit. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email. Time sensitive. Oh." Ophelia had sent him a message through an encrypted email service he'd never used before, with instructions for downloading a secure communication app. Once connected, her message was brief but urgent. "FBI agent Cross is dead. Car accident this morning, but too convenient. Need to meet tonight. Usual place unsafe. Remember where we discussed Thoreau last semester, 11 p.m. Thaddeus deleted the message and felt his blood run cold. Agent Lysander Cross, their potential contact within law enforcement, had been eliminated just as they'd planned to reach out to him. The timing couldn't be coincidental. The reference to Thoreau meant Walden Pond State Park, about 30 minutes outside Millbrook, where he and Ophelia had taken their students for an environmental literature field trip the previous spring. It was isolated enough to avoid electronic surveillance and familiar enough that they could navigate it in darkness. Leaving his house without being detected would require careful planning. The surveillance network now knew he was a threat, which meant they'd be monitoring his movements closely, but Thaddeus had spent years teaching students about creative problem-solving, and now he needed to apply those skills to escape the web of observation surrounding him. He began by establishing a routine that would explain his extended absence. Loud classical music, lights on throughout the house, periodic movement near windows to suggest he was home working on lesson plans, activities that would register on audio and visual surveillance as normal evening behavior. Then, using a technique he'd seen in spy movies but never imagined needing, he slipped out through his basement laundry room, which connected to a utility tunnel that ran between houses in his development. The tunnel was cramped and uncomfortable, but it emerged in a storm drain system that could take him several blocks away from his house without surface exposure. Walden Pond State Park, after dark, was an eerie landscape of shadows and nocturnal sounds. Thaddeus made his way carefully along the familiar trails, using his phone's flashlight sparingly to avoid attracting attention. When he reached the secluded clearing where they'd held their literature discussions, Ophelia was already waiting. "Thank God you made it," she said, emerging from behind a large oak tree. "I wasn't sure you'd get the Thoreau reference. What happened to Agent Cross?" "Single car accident on Highway 26 this morning. Lost control, hit a tree, died instantly. But I found news reports of 3 other federal agents who've died in accidents over the past month, all of them working on cases involving domestic surveillance programs." Ophelia had brought a laptop running on battery power, its screen providing the only light in their forest meeting place. "I've been analyzing the Phase 3 documents we found on Cornelius's drive. It's worse than we thought." She showed him technical specifications for something called behavioral modification protocols, a system designed to use surveillance data to identify individuals whose opinions or activities were deemed harmful to community stability, then systematically manipulate their environment to discourage such behavior. "They're not just watching people," Thaddeus realized as he read the technical details. "They're planning to actively control how people think and act." "The pilot program is scheduled to launch in Millbrook next week," Ophelia confirmed. They'll start with small interventions, targeted advertising, selective information delivery through social media, minor bureaucratic obstacles for people who express dissenting opinions. But the system is designed to escalate to more aggressive measures if necessary. She pulled up another document that made Thaddeus's skin crawl. Look at this target list. The file contained names, addresses, and detailed behavioral profiles for 37 Millbrook residents who had been flagged for Phase 3 intervention. Thaddeus recognized many of the names. Neighbors, colleagues, local business owners who had committed no crimes other than expressing political opinions, attending community meetings, or asking questions about local government decisions. "My name is on this list," he said, finding his own entry in the database. "So is mine," Ophelia replied grimly, "along with anyone else who's shown signs of what they call disruptive curiosity about community affairs." The profile descriptions were chilling in their clinical detachment. Thaddeus's entry described him as potential community influencer with anti-surveillance attitudes and access to youth population through educational role, recommended for intensive behavioral modification, beginning with employment pressure and social isolation protocols. "They're going to destroy our lives," he said quietly. "Not if we stop them first," Ophelia replied with determination. "I've been working on an alternative plan since Agent Cross was eliminated." She explained that she'd managed to contact an investigative journalist named Araminta Blackwood, who specialized in exposing government surveillance programs. Blackwood worked for a major national news organization and had the resources and legal protection necessary to publish their evidence safely. "But we need more than just documents," Ophelia continued. "We need proof that the surveillance system is actually operating in Millbrook. Real-time evidence that shows the scope of what they're collecting. How do we get that?" "We're going to hack into the surveillance network itself," she said with a grin that was equal parts excitement and terror. "I've figured out how to access the local data processing center that coordinates all the neighborhood surveillance. If we can document what information they're actually collecting and analyzing, we'll have evidence that no one can dismiss or suppress." Thaddeus stared at her in the laptop's glow. "That's extremely dangerous. If they catch us actively breaking into their systems, we won't live long enough to publish anything." "Then we'd better not get caught," Ophelia replied. "The data center is located in that new office building on Industrial Avenue, the one that claims to be a telecommunications company, but never seems to have any employees coming or going." They spent the next hour planning their infiltration. Ophelia had identified security weaknesses in the building's network infrastructure, while Thaddeus would handle physical reconnaissance and serve as lookout during the operation. As they prepared to leave their forest meeting place, both of their phones simultaneously received an automated call from Millbrook's emergency notification system. "This is an automated emergency alert for residents of Millbrook. Due to a potential terrorist threat, a temporary curfew is now in effect from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Residents should remain in their homes and report any suspicious activity to local law enforcement immediately." They looked at each other with growing alarm. It was already past 11 p.m., which meant they were now officially violating an emergency curfew that had been implemented with no advance warning. "They're escalating the situation," Ophelia said, "probably hoping to make it easier to detain anyone who's investigating their operations. Or they're preparing to implement Phase 3 ahead of schedule," Thaddeus replied. "A curfew would give them more control over community behavior and make it harder for residents to organize any kind of resistance." As they made their way back through the dark forest toward their vehicles, Thaddeus couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time. The surveillance system that had started as a seemingly harmless community safety app had revealed itself as something far more sinister, a comprehensive tool for social control that threatened the fundamental freedoms that defined American democracy. Tomorrow night, they would attempt to gather the evidence needed to expose the program to the world. But first, they had to survive the increasingly dangerous game of surveillance and counter-surveillance that was turning their quiet community into a battlefield between freedom and control. The stakes had never been higher, and failure would mean not just their own destruction, but the successful implementation of a surveillance state in communities across America. The Millbrook Data Processing Center occupied a nondescript 3-story building on Industrial Avenue, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire that seemed excessive for a telecommunications company. Thaddeus and Ophelia observed the facility from a coffee shop across the street, noting the sophisticated security measures that protected whatever operations were occurring inside. 6 external cameras motion sensors along the fence line, and at least 2 guards making regular patrols, Ophelia catalogued, studying the building through binoculars. But look at the power consumption. She pointed to the electrical infrastructure serving the building, multiple high-capacity power lines, and backup generators that suggested massive computer operations running continuously. That's enough electricity to power a small city. Whatever they're processing in there requires enormous computing resources. Thaddeus checked his watch. The emergency curfew had been extended indefinitely, with roving police patrols now enforcing compliance throughout Millbrook. Several neighbors had already been detained for curfew violations, creating an atmosphere of fear that was keeping most residents confined to their homes. The journalist, Araminta Blackwood, is standing by to publish our story, Ophelia continued. But she needs verifiable evidence of the surveillance operations, screenshots of data collection interfaces, documented proof of the behavioral analysis systems, something that can't be dismissed as fabricated. Their plan was relatively simple, but extremely dangerous. Ophelia would use her technical skills to breach the building's network security, while Thaddeus provided reconnaissance and early warning of security threats. If successful, they would have evidence of domestic surveillance operations that violated fundamental constitutional principles. As darkness fell, they moved into position. The building's rear entrance was less heavily monitored, with a service door that Ophelia believed she could bypass using techniques she'd learned during her computer security studies. The greater challenge would be accessing the computer systems inside without triggering automated security alerts. "Remember," she whispered as they approached the fence, "we need to be in and out within 30 minutes. Any longer, and we risk detection by automated monitoring systems." The fence proved easier to breach than expected. A section near the loading dock had been weakened by weather and age, allowing them to create an opening large enough to slip through. Inside the compound, they moved carefully between shadows, avoiding the patrol routes they'd observed earlier. The service door's electronic lock yielded to Ophelia's specialized equipment after several tense minutes of manipulation. Inside, the building hummed with the constant sound of cooling fans and electronic equipment, confirmation that massive computing operations were indeed running continuously. The first floor appeared to be ordinary office space, but the second floor revealed the true nature of the facility. Row upon row of computer servers filled rooms that had been converted into a high-tech data processing center, with multiple workstations displaying real-time surveillance feeds from hundreds of cameras throughout Millbrook and surrounding communities. "This is incredible," Ophelia breathed, approaching one of the active workstations. "Look at the scope of what they're monitoring." The screens showed live feeds from security cameras, traffic monitors, even smartphones and smart home devices that had been compromised by the Neighbor Watch Pro system. More disturbing were the behavioral analysis programs running in real time, tracking individual residents' movements, social interactions, and activities with the precision of a military intelligence operation. Ophelia quickly connected her portable drive to one of the workstations, downloading evidence files while documenting the surveillance capabilities with her camera. "They're not just collecting data," she said, pointing to analysis programs tracking political affiliations, social connections, and behavioral patterns. "They're building comprehensive psychological profiles of the entire population." Thaddeus monitored the hallways while studying additional workstations. Each screen revealed new aspects of the surveillance program's scope: financial monitoring, communication interception, even health data collected from fitness trackers and medical devices. No aspect of residents' private lives was beyond the system's reach. "Here," Ophelia called softly, having accessed what appeared to be the program's central command interface. "This is the evidence we need." The main control screen displayed a real-time map of Millbrook with color-coded indicators showing each resident's current threat level based on their recent activities and communications. Green indicators marked residents who were compliant and posed no security concerns, while yellow and red indicators identified people who were considered increasingly problematic. "Look at the action protocols," Thaddeus said, studying the system's automated response capabilities. The program was designed to automatically implement various interventions based on residents' threat levels, from subtle manipulation of information delivery and social media feeds to more aggressive measures like financial pressure, employment difficulties, and social isolation tactics. "It's a complete social control system," Ophelia realized, continuing to download evidence files. "They can manipulate every aspect of a person's life based on surveillance data." As she worked, Thaddeus noticed something that made his blood run cold. A section of the control interface was labeled Active Interventions, and it showed ongoing operations targeting specific Millbrook residents. His own name appeared on the list, along with planned actions designed to isolate him professionally and personally. "They've already started implementing Phase 3, he said urgently. "Look at this." The Active Interventions list showed systematic campaigns against dozens of residents who had been flagged for their political opinions, community involvement, or questioning of local authority. The operations included everything from manipulated credit reports and employment sabotage to orchestrated social conflicts designed to isolate targets from their support networks. "We need to get this information out immediately," Ophelia said, but as she spoke, alarms began sounding throughout the building. "Motion detectors on the 3rd floor have been activated," a computerized voice announced over the building's security system. "Initiating lockdown procedures." Heavy doors slammed shut throughout the facility, trapping them inside while security personnel were automatically alerted to their presence. Through the windows, Thaddeus could see vehicles approaching the building, black SUVs that suggested federal agents rather than local security guards. "Emergency exit," Ophelia said, grabbing her portable drive and heading for the stairwell. But the doors were already sealed by the automated security system. "We're trapped," Thaddeus realized, watching through security monitors as armed agents surrounded the building. "Not necessarily," Ophelia replied, studying the building's structural plans on her laptop. "This is an old building that was retrofitted for computer operations. There should be maintenance tunnels connecting to the city's utility system." They found the access to the tunnel system in the building's basement, behind a panel marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The tunnels were cramped and dark, filled with electrical cables and water pipes, but they provided a way to escape the building without confronting the agents who were now searching the upper floors. As they crawled through the narrow passages, Ophelia's phone received a message from Araminta Blackwood. "Story ready to publish. Need final confirmation that evidence is verified." "Send it," Ophelia texted back. "We have everything needed to expose the program." The utility tunnels led to a storm drain system that eventually emerged in a park several blocks from the data processing center. As they climbed out of the underground passages, Thaddeus could see emergency vehicles and helicopters converging on the area they'd just escaped. "They're going to know we succeeded in accessing their systems," he said. "Which means we have very little time before they try to stop the story from being published," Ophelia replied, pulling out her laptop to contact the journalist directly. As dawn broke over Millbrook, Araminta Blackwood's exposé was published simultaneously by multiple news organizations, supported by the evidence that Ophelia had extracted from the surveillance center. The story revealed the existence of a massive domestic surveillance program operating in over 200 American communities, collecting comprehensive data on millions of citizens without their knowledge or consent. The evidence was undeniable: screenshots of surveillance interfaces, documentation of behavioral modification protocols, proof of systematic privacy violations that shocked the American public and prompted immediate congressional investigations. Within hours, federal authorities were forced to suspend the Neighbor Watch Pro program pending investigation, while civil rights organizations filed lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of the surveillance operations. But the victory came at a cost. Cornelius Blackthorne remained missing, presumably relocated to prevent his testimony about the program's operations. Agent Cross and several other law enforcement officials who had investigated the surveillance network were dead under suspicious circumstances. Most significantly, the investigation revealed that Millbrook had been just one test site in a much larger program designed to gradually normalize comprehensive surveillance of American citizens. Without their investigation and the journalists' courage in publishing the evidence, the surveillance system would have expanded to communities nationwide. Standing in his backyard a week later, Thaddeus noticed that most of his neighbors' surveillance cameras had been removed or disabled. The atmosphere of fear that had gripped Millbrook during the curfew was beginning to lift as residents learned the truth about the program they had unknowingly supported. Ophelia joined him, carrying a news report about congressional hearings investigating the surveillance program. "They're calling for a complete overhaul of domestic surveillance policies," she said. "Your testimony next week could help prevent this from happening to other communities." Thaddeus nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had won just one battle in a much larger war over privacy and freedom in American society. The technology that enabled such comprehensive surveillance still existed, and there would always be those who sought to use it for control rather than protection. The real question, he said thoughtfully, is whether people will remain vigilant enough to prevent this from happening again. It's easy to trade freedom for the promise of safety, but much harder to recognize when that trade has gone too far. Ophelia looked around at their quiet neighborhood, where families were beginning to emerge from the isolation and fear that had gripped them during the surveillance program's operation. Children were playing in yards again, neighbors were talking over fences, and the natural rhythms of community life were slowly returning. "At least now they know what to watch for," she replied. "Sometimes the best defense against surveillance is simply knowing that you're being watched." As they walked back toward his house, Thaddeus reflected on the lessons learned from their experience. The surveillance network had succeeded not through force, but through the gradual normalization of privacy violations in the name of safety and convenience. People had voluntarily installed the very devices that were used to monitor and potentially control them. His phone buzzed with a text message, not a threat this time, but a simple note from a neighbor. "Thank you for asking the right questions." Similar messages had been arriving all week, from residents who were grateful that someone had been willing to investigate when things didn't seem right, even at considerable personal risk. The surveillance program had been defeated not by government oversight or corporate responsibility, but by ordinary citizens who refused to accept that comprehensive monitoring was necessary for community safety. 3 months later, as Thaddeus testified before a congressional committee investigating domestic surveillance programs, he emphasized that the most important lesson from Millbrook was the need for citizens to remain actively engaged in protecting their own privacy and freedom. "Technology can be a powerful tool for community safety," he told the assembled representatives, "but it can also be a powerful tool for social control. The difference lies not in the technology itself, but in who controls it, how it's used, and whether citizens maintain the right to say no." The Neighbor Watch Pro program was permanently shut down, its operators prosecuted for violations of privacy laws and civil rights. But Thaddeus knew that similar programs would inevitably emerge, using different names and promising different benefits, as long as people were willing to trade their privacy for perceived security. The real victory wasn't stopping one surveillance program. It was proving that ordinary citizens could still investigate, resist, and ultimately defeat systems designed to monitor and control them. In an age of increasing technological surveillance, that knowledge was perhaps the most valuable treasure of all. The harmless app his neighbor had recommended had turned out to be anything but harmless. But the community's ability to recognize and resist that threat had proven that democracy and privacy could still be defended by people willing to ask uncomfortable questions and seek difficult truths.